All right. Uh, just a note on why it's called the L0 project. That's totally tongue in cheek. I don't believe in the L1, L2 dichotomy. What is it? It's programming for NSM, but one of my goals is to actually program in NSM and program the programming for NSM in NSM as much as possible. I started well over a year ago with Francisco Zamblera's becalmed NSM Dahlia. And I noticed that he's not really storing NSM articulations as knowledge. It's not vertical through the meaning hierarchy. I also had a problem of like, well, I need a sufficiently flexible parser, and I found one in a language called Haskell, and it's. I'm not going to give you the blow by blow. I translated that parser into Java and did a little bit of web programming for an interface. And I think these are good moves because my analogy is programs these days are kind of like lobsters. There's like a lot of exoskeleton and a lot of muscle, but not much brain. But a lot of people know how to do exoskeleton and muscle, and very few people know Prolog and Haskell. Where things stand now is okay. This parser's been recoded in Java. There's a crude web interface, and I'm starting to do some logic programming in NSM. And here's a really short NSM program. Okay, it says some pretty obvious things. Then it says something that we know in real life is false. That if someone's alive, that person is good. And then the last line is just temporary convention here is you should read that as who is good? All right. And this will give you an idea of how crude things still are. It gives you an answer. And among the other things, it's a little bit loquacious, tells you something you already know. But then if you look down here, be good I, be good you. This is we're mirroring an internal representation of things that it figured out from knowing or believing, shall we say, that someone who's alive is someone who's good. All right. Uh, and then it's NSM parse trees because I wanted to show something about how it parses. All the type information on the fragments from these sentences it relates to how applicative universal grammar parsing works. It has to be better. Um, all right. So, but one of the things I discovered early on was, why? Wait a minute. What's going on here? If I be good, I live doesn't parse correctly. It's like, oh, what's the problem here? And what it turned out to be is that it thought that good I was a valid term. Um, and this was because declare that I is a kind of someone. All right. So I thought, oh, well, if you're kind of someone, then you can be a good someone. We say that he's a good person, right? That's normal. I'm a good me. Several question marks. All right. So I thought, well, I could add a grammar rule, but there's something kind of missing here. Why is good me ordinarily kind of odd? And it's modifiability to be able to say something's good or bad or far or near or whatever implies that things cannot be that way, right? It implies plurality, whereas there's just one me and there's just one you. Um, so I said that, well, this is a Gricean error. And look, I understand the NSM view of Grice's maxims. Obviously, shouldn't be the gold standard of human communication. It does violence to the nature of language. Uh, Still, someone once said violence is never the answer, but sometimes it makes a very good question. All right. So I applied it as a question of how to architect the system. Just you can express Grice's maxims more or less in NSM. There's probably some wrinkles here that aren't covered, but if I can program in NSM, I can program Grice's maxims in NSM, and then I can use them to judge the acceptability of certain expressions. All right. So if you said before you're good, you're violating quantity. You're not communicating economic. You're basically sounding disingenuously self-aggrandizing. If you say good me, you're repeating. If you said you're bad, you're contradicting yourself, and that violates the quality maxim. But over and above all that, there's only one you. All right. So what is this about a good me and a bad me? So that would be the superficial rejection of it. But I think there are interesting questions here. Um, for reductive paraphrase, Grice's maxims are almost perfect. I mean, you basically want to be brief and to the point and correct and all that. Um, and for me, it's like, okay, it gives me something more to program. So, here's Grice's maxims for the particular case, the good me case that I mentioned. More or less in something that I hope someday my code will parse and execute. All right. But then there's some deeper issues here. It's like, okay, well, why do we say this? People do say this. All right. I'm moody. There are times when I'm good or bad. I have my good side and my bad side. There are these dimensions of personal identity that are alluded to by, I call it rhetorically performative solecism. You're making a little mistake to draw attention to a point. All right. So you could reject something on Gricean grounds, but sort of fail over to, okay, what are the cultural scripts of personal identity? All right. And then represent that internally in the program as, well, what you really mean is, I'm good at these times, bad at these times. I'm good in these ways. I'm bad in those ways. And I had to learn a lot about culturally embedded me, learning Japanese. How do you select the right lexical exponent for a given social context? All right. Um, just a thought here about thinking. It turns out Alan Turing was a fairly deep philosopher of AI almost before there were computers to program. And he said that intelligence is an emotion word. And I hope someone takes that up. All right. And okay, now there's a question, why am I doing all this? I mean, programming is hard. It takes a lot of basically all my free time recently. What's my motivation? There's some my own little NGO work that I do in a post-conflict zone in the Philippines. And it's very narrowly focused. There's a tiny satellite that I think can be used as a STEM education platform to teach physics, electronics, programming, other topics. I've also had an ambition for years of making programming culture free. I mean, programming language is just there was literally a paper in the 1960s called tongue in cheek, the next 700 programming languages. I mean, programmers just keep inventing these new languages, and some of them take off, and almost all of them don't. And they all form these little subcultures. But what if we could program in one natural language and have it automatically and losslessly translated to another one? Uh, I mean, the business benefits of that would be considerable, but there are other benefits. One thing I'm looking at is how do you empower minority language speakers? Um, and what can this do for democratic federalism, which is the lack of which is cause of so much conflict in the world, in the Philippines, and unfortunately, it's one of the roots of the Ukraine crisis too. Um, so it gets back to what Cliff said last year about how Bert Peters said he thought of NANOSEM as something as good for the world. And he also said that Bert Peters worked hard. And I think the good that he wanted to do was part of his motivation. And this is why I do it. Unpaid, long hours, uh, because I want the good me. And that's the thought.